But let's get the audience sort of acclimated to who it is that you certainly are, because as I mentioned off air, like people are so intrigued by people that are, form what we deem as like the former comic pros that have been kind of doing things for the Marvels of the world and DCs of the world. Tell me, just lay it on, take as much time as you need, kind of your experience kind of being in that space, and then obviously kind of crossing into the more in the independent space. Let the audience know of the difference, the benefits, the highs, the lows, just everything that you've been a part of.
Right. I worked for DC Comics for 20 some odd years altogether. When I first started out working for the company, it was before AOL bought Warner Brothers, and I was working at the WB store in retail. It's weird. My check stubs back when I was 19 or so working retail were the same as like when I was working at DC Comics, and I was in the system and everything. So technically I'd been working for the company that long. I started off folding Superman t-shirts. I ended up getting into comics, but when I first got into comics, they wouldn't trust me and hire me for interior pages because I was just a young kid. And how did they know I would get the deadline done? So I ended up being shuffled to the licensing department. A lot of times now you'll see a Batman t-shirt or something. It's something I drew almost 20 years ago, and they just keep reusing the same image. At the time, the money seemed good, but there's no royalty system to it. I probably spent all that money I was paid for those t-shirts, buying them every time I come across it in the store. From there, they were like, he draws a really good Batman. And I got some issues on Batman. I worked on Under the Hood when they brought Jason Todd back. And I think it was like DC Comics for the month, third #1 selling comic. They made so much money off that book. And from there, I ended up working with people like Brad Meltzer on Justice League, Michael Straczynski on Superman Earth 1. That was like knocking out of the park. I think we were on the New York Times bestsellers list for 40 some weeks total. And we were there until we got knocked off because Barnes & Noble pulled the book off the shelves because they did an exclusive Kindle deal. And that was a big competitor for Barnes & Noble. So we would have sold a lot more if it wasn't for a dumb deal that people did with a digital copy of the book. Then I created a lot of the Red Lanterns that you see in video games like Justice League and Justice 2, Jackstar, Belize, Scale. I basically created all the Red Lanterns except for Atrocitus, the main leader. And they get around in a lot of Lego games. It's interesting to create something on paper and then see it worked around into so many areas like superhero girls or Legos, even some video game like Injustice 2. And then there for a while, I left DC Comics and I worked with Legendary, the movie studio. I worked with them with Max Brooks and Mark Waid. I was working mainly with Thomas Tull, who was the owner of the studio at the time before they got bought out. And this is back when they were doing the third Dark Knight movie. They were getting ready to transition away from Warner Brothers to Paramount is who they were going to. So they moved away from that and they were trying to build a lot of new IP. And then working with a movie studio, I end up sitting in conversations and talking to the same people that make the movies like Pacific Rim, and working with Max Brooks from World War Z. So I was working with people from all different backgrounds, and I could really see the Hollywood dynamic. And around that time, I didn't realize the reason Legendary was interested in me is because they were pulling so much of my Superman stuff for Man of Steel, which they were co-oping with Warner Brothers. And then Man of Steel came out. I was like, oh, now I understand how I ended up at Legendary because they were like, we were using so much of your book for that. I've worked around comics and entertainment in so many ways. Generally, I'm a comic guy, but there's so much with transmedia that you end up crossing over. It was interesting those 3 years I worked with Legendary because you could see the enthusiasm because they were buying up the Nerdist. They were really trying to come in, boots on the ground, and they would throw around these words, and you could tell these people didn't mean it, some of them. But they'd be like, we're going geek with this. I'm geeking out these words in the meeting. It's like, dude, that doesn't use that right. It's like, it was funny, but it's like, oh, man, you guys are just coming for that geek money. That's what you're saying. And because you do a design and like, hey, can you get that mask off that character? It's like, yeah, that looks really cool. Yeah, I know it looks really cool, but what if there's an actor's face there? And I'm like, oh, man. What was interesting to me is I started to look back and I'm like, I don't think if Hollywood controlled comics, we would have Spider-Man, we would have Green Goblin, that type of dynamic, that cool visuals that came from comics. And that's when I knew knew everything was going to go wrong in comics because Hollywood was really going to come in and they were going to start trying to manipulate these characters and tailor them to being more fashionable for either actors and agents. You could tell they couldn't make source material comics. We're seeing that more and more as these studios take over Marvel and DC Comics. I don't think a Jack Kirby could come out today. I don't even know if a Frank Miller could come out today and make a book. And basically, I realized studios were invading the comic system for the worse. It's like when you put something in an ecosystem, and a new animal, a new predator, it can throw off the whole balance of everything. And I felt like that's where we're at with comics today. So the last thing I was mainly working on with DC Comics was Metal Men. I basically was working with Metal Men because of Dan Didio, who was the publisher at the time. I'd been friends with him for years, and the characters meant a lot to him, and he wanted to work on the book, but he wanted me to work with him on it. And he had been a big advocate. He'd given me some really big hits in the day. So I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. And I was around for when he was no longer with the company. But I guess working with him and being close, there was one executive guy at Warner Brothers who had always left DC Comics alone and let them make their comics. And he kind of looked at it as Warner Brothers would just make t-shirts, leave them alone, let them make comics. And there'd been all these steps to pull DC Comics from the East Coast to the West Coast. So they're closing the distance between DC Comics. And eventually that guy left with the merger, the AT&T Warner Brothers merger. He had left though on a different reason. I think he got Me Too'd or something like that. And he stepped down. And there was a concern, what does that mean for DC Comics? It really wasn't out there on the street. This was more of an internal in the company thing. Right. Like what happens when the guy was saying, leave this comic company alone, let them make comics and let us reap all the benefits. What would happen? And obviously we're seeing that now, right? We're seeing that they're not protected anymore. They're not left alone. And it was interesting just being that close to Dan and hearing these type of concerns. And then thinking back, it's like over a course of a few months, everything went to shit.